Infinite Jest by David Foster Wallace, page 281. They returned from Long Island bearing their shields rather than upon them, as they say. John Wayne and Hal Candenza lost only 5 total games between them in singles. The A doubles had resembled a spatter painting, and the B teams, especially the distaffs, had surpassed themselves. The whole PWTA staff and squad had to sing a really silly song. Coyle and Trollsch didn't win, and Teddy Schott had, incredibly, lost to his squat, spin doctory opponent in 3 sets, despite the kid's debilitating nerves at crucial junctures. The fact that Schott wasn't all that upset got remarked on by staff. Schott and a conspicuously energized Jim Trollsch rallied for the big win in 18A number 2 dubs. Trollsch's disconnected microphone mysteriously disappeared from his gear bag during post-double showers, to the rejoicing of all. Pemulus's storky, intense, 2 hands-off both sides opponent had gotten weirdly lethargic and then disoriented in the second set, after Pemulus had lost the first in a tiebreak. After the kid had delayed play for several minutes, claiming the tennis balls were too pretty to hit, PWTA trainers had conducted him gently from the court, and the Peemster got VD, which is Junior Circuit Argot for a victory by default. The fact that Pemulus hadn't walked around with his chest out recounting the win for any ETA females got remarked on only by Hal and T. Axford. Schott was in too much knee pain to remark on much of anything, and Stitt had ETA's Barry Loach inject the big purple knee with something that made Schott's eyes roll up in his head. Then, during the post-meet mixer and dance, Pemulus's defaulted opponent ate from the hors d'oeuvres table without using utensils, or at one point even hands, did a disco number when there wasn't any music going on, and was finally heard telling the Port Washington headmaster's wife that he'd always wanted to do her from behind. Pemulus spent a lot of time whistling and staring innocently up at the prefab ceiling. The bus for all the 18 squads was warm, and there were little nozzles of light over your seat that you could either have on to do homework or shut off and sleep. Trollsch, left eye ominously nystagmic, pretended to recap the day's match highlights for a subscription audience, speaking earnestly into his fist. The C team Stockhausen was pretending to sing opera. Hal and tall Paul Shaw were each reading an SAT prep guide. A good quarter of the bus was yellow highlighting copies of E.A. Abbott's inescapable at ETA book Flatland for either Flockman or Chawaf or Thorpe. An elongated darkness with assorted shapes melted by, plus long gauntlets near exits of tall interstatish lamps laying down cones of dirty-looking sodium light. The ghastly sodium lamplight made Mario and Candenza happy to be in his little cone of white, inside light. Mario sat next to K.D. Coyle, who was kind of mentally slow, especially after a hard loss, and they played rock, paper, scissors for 200 clicks or more, not saying anything, engrossed in trying to locate patterns in each other's rhythms of choices of shapes, which they both decided there weren't any. 2 or 3 upperclassmen in Levi Richardson O'Byrne Chawaf's disciplinary lit were slumped over Goncharov's Oblomov, looking very unhappy indeed. Charles Tavis sat way in the back with John Wayne and beamed and spoke nonstop in hushed tones to Wayne as the Canadian stared out the window. DeLint was with the 16s 1 bus back. He'd been ragging Steese's and Cornspan's asses since their doubles, which it looked like they practically gave away. The bus was Stittless. Stitt always found a private, mysterious way back, then appeared at dawn drills with DeLint and elaborate workups of everything that had gone wrong the day before. He was particularly shrill and insistent and negative after they'd won something. Schott sat listing to port and didn't respond when hands were waved in front of his face. And Axford and Struck started kibitzing Barry Loach about their knees, were feeling punk as well. The luggage rack over everyone's heads bristled with grips and coverless strings and liniment and tincture of benzoin, which had been handed out and liberally applied, so the warm air became complexly spiced. Everybody was tired in a good way. The homeward ride's camaraderie was marred only by the fact that someone near the back of the bus started the passing around of a Gothic fonted leaflet offering the kingdom of prehistoric England to the man who could pull Keith Freer out of Bernadette Longley. Freer had been discovered by Protector Mary Esther Thode more or less zing poor Bernadette Longley under an Adidas blanket in the very back seat on the bus trip to the East Coast Blaze in Providence in September. And it had been a nasty scene because there were some basic academy license rules that it was just unacceptable to flout under the nose of the staff. Keith Freer was deeply asleep when the leaflet was getting passed around, but Bernadette Longley wasn't. And when the leaflet hit the front half where all the females now had to sit since September, she'd bury her face in her hands and flushed even on the back of her pretty neck. And her doubles partner came all the way back to where Jim Struck and Michael Pemulus were sitting and told them in no uncertain terms that somebody on this bus was so immature it was really sad. Charles Tavis was irrepressible. He did a Pierre Trudeau impersonation no one except the driver was old enough to laugh at. And the whole mammoth traveling squad, 3 buses worth, got to stop and have the mega breakfast at Denny's over next to Empire Waste at like 0:30 when they got in. Hal's eldest brother, Oren Incandenza, got out of competitive tennis when Hal was 9 and Mario nearly 11. This was during the period of great pre-experialist upheaval and the emergence of the fringe CUSP of Johnny Gentle, famous crooner, and the tumescence of ONANism. At late 17, Oren was ranked in the low 70s nationally. He was a senior. He was at that awful age for a low 70s player where age 18 and the terminus of a junior career are looming, and either one, you're going to surrender your dreams of the show and go to college and play college tennis, or two, you're going to get your full spectrum of gram negative and cholera and amoebic dysentery shots and try to eke out some kind of sad diasporic existence on a Eurasian satellite pro tour and try to hop those last few competitive plateaus up to show caliber as an adult. Or three, or you don't know what you're going to do. And it's often an awful time. ETA tries to dilute the awfulness a little by letting 8 or 9 postgraduates stay on for 2 years and serve in DeLint's platoon of pro-rectors in exchange for room and board and travel expenses to small, sad satellite tourneys. And Oren's being directly related to ETA administration obviously gave him kind of a lock on a pro-rector appointment if he wanted it. But a pro-rector's job was only for maybe at most a few years and was regarded as sad and purgatorial. And then, of course, what then? What are you going to do after that? Etc. Oren's decision to attend college pleased his parents a great deal, though Mrs. Averill Incandenza especially had gone out of her way to make it clear that whatever Oren decided to do would please them, because they stood squarely behind and in full support of him. Oren, and any decision his very best thinking yielded. But they were still in favor of college. Privately, you could tell. Oren was clearly not ever going to be a professional caliber adult tennis player. His competitive peak had come at 13 when he'd gotten to the 14 and under quarterfinals at the National Clays in Indianapolis, Indiana, and in the quarters had taken a set off the second seed, but starting soon after that, he'd suffered athletically from the same delayed puberty that had compromised his father when himself had been a junior player. And having boys he'd cleaned the clocks of at 12 and 13 become now seemingly overnight mannish and deep chested and hairy legged, and starting now to clean Oren's own clock at 14 and 15. This had sucked some kind of competitive afflatus out of him, broken his tennis spirit. Oren and his USTA ranking had nosedived through 3 years until it leveled off somewhere in the low 70s, which meant that by age 15 he wasn't even qualifying for the major events' main 64-man draw. When ETA opened, his ranking among the boys' 18s hovered around 10, and he was relegated to a middle spot on the Academy B squad, a mediocrity that sort of becalmed his verve even further. His style was essentially that of a baseliner, a counterpuncher, but without the return of serve or passing shots you need to stand much of a chance against a quality netman. The ETA rap on Oren was that he lobbed well, but too often. He did have a phenomenal lob. He could hug the curve of the dome of the lung and 3 times out of 4 nail a large size coin placed on the opposite baseline. He and Marlon Bain and 2 or 3 other marginal counterpunching boys at ETA all had phenomenal lobs, honed through spare PM devoted more and more to Eschaton, which, by the most plausible account, a Croatian refugee transfer, had brought up from the Palmer Academy in Tampa. Oren was Eschaton's first game master at ETA, where in the first Eschaton generations it was mostly marginal and diaphlaticized upperclassmen who played. College was the comparatively obvious choice then for Oren, as the time of decision drew nigh. Oblique family pressures aside, as a low ranked player at ETAs, he had stiffer academic demands than those for whom the real show had seemed like a viable goal. And the eschatonology helped a great deal. With the math computer stuff, ETA tended to be a bit weak in. Both himself and Stitt being at that point pretty anti quantitative. His grades were solid. His board scores weren't going to embarrass anyone. Oren was basically academically sound, especially for somebody with the top level competitive sport on his secondary transcript. And you have to understand that mediocrity is relative in a sport like junior tennis. A national ranking of 74 in boys 18 and under singles, while mediocre by the standards of aspiring pros, is enough to make most college coaches' chins shiny. Oren got a couple Pac 10 offers, Big 10 offers. University of New Mexico actually hired a mariachi band that established itself under his dorm's window 6 nights running until Mrs. Incandenza got himself to authorize FDV hard to electrify the fences. Ohio State flew him out to Columbus for such a weekend of prospective orientation that when Oren got back, he had to stay in bed for 3 days drinking Alka Seltzer with an ice pack on his groin. Caltech offered him an ROTC waiver and AP standing in their elite strategic studies program after Decade magazine had run a short interest piece on Oren and the Croat and Escheton's applied use of C pink to the second 95th. Oren chose BU Boston U, not a tennis power, not in Caltech's league academically, not the sort of place that hires bands or flies you out for Roman orgies of inducement. And only just about 3 clicks down the hill and Calm Avenue from ETA west of the Bay, around the intersection of Commonwealth and Beacon, Boston. It was kind of a joint Oren and Candenza, Avril and Candenza decision. Oren's moms privately thought it was an important thing for Oren to be away from home, psychologically speaking, but still to be able to come home whenever he wished. She put everything to Oren in terms of worrying that her concern over what been best for him psychologically might prompt her to overstep her maternal bounds and speak out of turn or give intrusive advice. According to all her lists and advantage disadvantage charts, BU was from every angle far and away O's best choice. But to keep ever from overstepping or lobbying intrusively, the moms actually for 6 weeks would flee any room Oren entered, both hands clapped over her mouth. Oren had this way his face would get when she'd beg him not to let her influence his choice. It was during this period that Oren had characterized the moms to Hal as a kind of contortionist with other people's bodies, which Hal's never been able to forget. Himself, from his own experience, probably thought it better for Oren to get the hell out of Dodge altogether, do something Midwest or PAC, but he kept his own counsel. He never had to struggle not to overstep. He probably figured Oren was a big boy. This was 4 years and 30 some released entertainments before himself put his head in a microwave oven fatally. Then it turned out Avril's adoptive slash half brother, Charles Davis, who, at this time, was back chairman ASA at Throckmorton, Hampshire, turned out to be an old minor sport athletic administration network friends with Boston University's varsity tennis coach. Tavis flew down special on Air Canada to set up a meeting between the four of them: Avril and Son and Tavis and the BU tennis coach. The BU tennis coach was a septuagenarian Ivy League guy, one of those emptily, craggly, handsome old patrician men whose profiles look like it ought to be on a coin, who liked his lads to wear all white and actually literally vault the net, win or lose, after matches. BU had only had a couple of nationally ranked players like ever, and that had been in the AD 1960s, way before this fashion conscious guy's tenure. And when the coach saw Oren play, he about fell over sideways. Recall how mediocrity is contextual. BU's players all hailed, literally, from New England country clubs and wore iron shirts and those faggy white tennis sweaters with that blood colored stripe across the chest, and talked without moving their jaw, and played the sort of stiff and patrician serve and volley game you play if you've had lots of summer lessons and club round robins, but had never, ever had to get out there and kill or die psychically. Oren wore cut off jeans and deck sneakers without socks and yawned compulsively as he beat BU's immaculately groomed number one singles man 2-0, hitting him something like 40 offensive lobs for winners. Then, at the four-way meeting Tavis arranged, the old BU coach showed up in LL Bean chinos and a Lacoste polo shirt and got a look at the size of Oren's left arm and then at Oren's mom's in a tight black skirt and levantine jacket with kohl around her eyes and a moosed tower of hair and about fell back over sideways the other way. She had this effect on older men somehow. Oren was in a position to dictate terms limited only by the parameters of BU's own sports budget marginality. Oren signed a letter of intent accepting a full ride to BU, plus books and a Hitachi laptop with software and off campus housing and living expensive and a lucrative work study job where his job was to turn on the sprinklers every morning at the BU Football Terriers' historic Nickerson Field, sprinklers that were already on automatic timers. The sprinkler job was BU's tennis team's one plum recruitment wise. Charles Tavis, who at Avril's urging that fall cashed in his Canadian return ticket and stay on as assistant headmaster to assist Oren's father's oversight of the academy in a progressively more and more total capacity as both in and external travels took Jo and Candenza away from Enfield more and more often, said 3.5 years later that he'd never really expected a thank you from Oren anyway for liaisoning with the BU tennis apparatus, that he wasn't in this for the thank yous, that a person who did a service for somebody's gratitude is more like a 2D cutout image of a person than a bona fide person. At least, that's what he thought, he said. He said, what did Avril and Hal and Mario think? Was he a genuine 3D person? Was he perhaps just rationalizing away some legitimate hurt? Did Oren maybe resent him for seeming to move in just as he, Oren, moved out? Though surely not for Tavis's assuming more and more total control of the ETA helm, as J.O. Incandenza spent increasingly long hiatus, either off with Mario on shoots or editing in his rooms off the tunnel. or in alcohol rehabilitative facilities, 13 of them over those final 3 years. Tavis has the Blue Cross statements right here. And even more surely, not for the final fellow, they say anyone with any kind of denial free sensitivity could have predicted for the past 3.5 years. But CT opined on 4 July WDPAH after Oren, who had now had plenty of free summertime, declined his fifth straight invitation back to Enfield and his family's annual barbecue and Wimbledon finals interlaced spontaneous dissemination watching. Oren might just be harboring a resentment over CT moving on to the headmaster's office and changing the doors te occidere posunt before himself's microwave head had even cooled. Even if it was to take over a headmaster's job that had been positively keening to have somebody sedulous and brisk take over. Incandenza himself, having eliminated his own map on 1 April of the year of the trial-sized Dove Bar, just as spring letters of intent were due from seniors who decided to slouch off to college tennis, just as invitations for the European dirt circuit invitationals were pouring in all over lateral Alice Moore's paraboloid desk, just as ETA's tax exempt status was coming up for review before the MDR exemption panel, just as the school was trying to readjust to the new ONANTA accreditation procedures after years of USTA accreditation procedures, just as litigations with Enfield Marine Public Health Hospital over alleged damage from ETA's initial hilltop flattening and with Empire waste displacement over the flight paths of flat concavity bound displacement vehicles were reaching the appellate stage, just as applications and fellowships for the fall term were in the final stages of review and response. Well, someone had to come in and fill the void of review and response. And that person was going to have to be someone who could achieve total worry without becoming paralyzed by the worry or by the absence of minimal thank yous for inglorious duties discharged in the stead of a person whose replacement was naturally going to come in for some resentment. Tavis felt, since since you can't get mad at a dying man, much less at a dead man, who better to assume the stress of filling in as anger object that the dead man's thankless, inglorious, sedulous, untiring 3D bureaucratic assistant and replacement, whose own upstairs room was right next to the HMH's master bedroom, and who might, by some grieving parties, be viewed as some kind of interloping usurper. Tavis had been ready for all this stress and more. He told the assembled academy in preparatory remarks before last year's fall convocation, speaking through amplification from the red and gray bunting draped crow's nest of Gerard Stitt's transom down into the rows of folding chairs arranged all along the basement and sidelines of ETA Court 6-9. He not only fully accepted the stress and resentment, he said he had worked hard and would continue in his dull, quiet, unromantic fashion to work hard to remain open to it, to this resentment and sense of loss and irreplaceability, even after 4 years, to let everyone who needed to get it out. The anger and resentment and possible contempt for their own psychological health, since Tavis acknowledged publicly that there was more than enough on every ETA's plate to begin with as it was. The Convocation Assembly was outside, on the center courts that in winter are sheltered by the lung. It was 31, August in the year of dairy products from the American heartland. Hot and muggy. Upperclassmen who'd heard these same remarks for the past 4 years made little razor to jugular hangman noose over imaginary crossbeam motions, listening. The sky overhead was glassy blue, between clots and strings of clouds moving swiftly north. On courts 30 to 32, the applied music chorus guys kept up a background of tenebrae facte sunt, sotto voce. Everybody had on the black armbands everybody still wore for functions and assemblies, to keep from forgetting, and the cotton US and crisp nylon ONAN flags flapped and clanked halfway down the driveway's poles in remembrance. The Sunstrand Plaza, still as of that fall, hadn't yet found a way to muffle its East Newton ATHSCME fans. And Tavis's voice, which, even with the police bullhorn, tended to sound distant and receding anyway, wove in and out of the sound of the fans and the whoomp of the EWD catapults and locust electric screams, and the exhaust rich hot rush of the summer wind up off Calm Avenue, and the car horns, and Green Line's trundle and clang, and the clank of the flagpoles and wires, and everybody but the staff and littlest kids up front missed most of Tavis's explanation that Salic lawed nothing to do with the fact that there was simply no way the late headmaster's beloved spouse, an ETA Dean of Academic Affairs, and of females Mrs. Avril Incandenza, could have become headmaster. How would headmistress have sounded? And she had the females and female protectors and HARD's custodians to oversee, and curricular and assignments and schedules, and complex new ONANTA accreditation to finalize the CAFCAN application. 4 plus daily HMH sterilization and personal ablution rituals, and the constant battle against anthracnose and dry climate blight in the dining room's green babies, plus, of course, ETA teaching duties on top of that, with the addition of untold sleepless nights with the militant grammarians of Massachusetts, the academic PAC that watchdogged media syntax and invited florid, fish lipped guys from the French Academy to come speak with trilled R's on prescriptive preservation, and held marathon multi readings of E.G. Orwell's Politics and the English Language, and whose Avril chaired Tactical Phalanx, MGMs, was then unsuccessfully, it turned out, court fighting the new Gentle administration's Title II G public funded library phase out VAT trimming initiative. Besides, of course, being practically laid out flat with grief and having to do all the emotional processing work attendant on working through that kind of personal trauma. On top of all of which, assuming the administrative tiller of ETA itself would have simply an insupportable burden, she's thanked CT effusively on more than one public occasion for taking the plush sinecure of Throppinghamshire and coming down to undertake the stress ridden tasks not only of bureaucratic administration and ensuring as smooth a transition as possible, but of being there for the Incandenza family itself, with or without thank yous, and for helping support not only Oren's career and institutional decision processes, but also for being there supportively for all involved when Oren made his seminal choice not to go ahead and play competitive college tennis after all at BU. What happened was that by the third week of his freshman year, Oren was attempting an extremely unlikely defection from college tennis to college football. The reason he gave his parents, Avril made it clear that the very last thing she wanted was to have any of her children feel they had to justify or explain to her any sort of abruptly or even bizarrely sudden major decision that they might happen to make. And it's not clear that the Mad Stork had even nailed down the fact that Oren was still in Metro Boston at BU in the first place. But Oren still felt the move demanded some kind of explanation. Was that full tennis practice had started, and he discovered that he was an empty, withered psychic husk, competitively burnt out. Oren had been playing, eating, sleeping, and excreting competitive tennis since his racket was bigger than he was. He said he realized he had at 18 become exactly as fine a tennis player as he was ever destined to be. The prospect of further improvement, a crucial carrot that Stitt and the ETA staff were expert at dangling, had disappeared at a fourth-rate tennis program whose coach had a poster of Bill Tilden in his office and offered critique on the level of bend your knees and watch the ball. This was all actually true, the burnout part, and totally swallowable as far as the from tennis part went, but Oren had a harder time explaining the decision to football component because partly he had only the vaguest understanding of U.S. football's rules, tactics, and non metric venue. He had, in fact, never even once touched a real pebbled leather football before, and like most serious tennis players, had always found the misshapen ball's schizoid bounces disorienting and upsetting to look at. In fact, the decision that had very little to do with football at all, or with the reason Oren ended up starting to give before Avril all but demanded that he stop feeling in any way pressured or compelled to do anything more than ask for their utter and unqualified support of whatever actions he felt his personal happiness required, which is what she did. When he started a slightly lyrical thing about the crash of pads and the sis boom bah of pep squad and ambiance of male bonding and smell of dewy turf at Nickerson Field at dawn, when he showed up to watch the sprinklers come on and turn the lemon wedge of risen sun into plumed rainbows of refraction. The refracting sprinklers part was actually true, and that he liked it. The rest had been fiction. The real football reason, in all its inevitable real reason banality, was that over the course of weeks of dawns of watching the auto sprinklers and the pep squad, which really did practice at dawn practices, Oren had developed a horrible schoolboy grade crush, complete with dilated pupils and weak knees, for a certain big haired sophomore baton twirler he watched twirl and strut from a distance through the diffracted spectrum of plumed sprinklers all the way across the field's dewy turf. A twirler who'd attended a few of the all athletic team mixers Oren and his sabistic BU doubles partner had gone to, and who danced the same way she twirled and invoked mass pep, which is to say, in a way that seemed to turn everything solid in Oren's body watery and distant and oddly refracted. Oren Incandenza, who, like many children of raging alcoholics and OCD sufferers, had internal addictive sexuality issues, had already drawn idle little sideways eights on the postcoital flanks of a dozen BU coeds. But this was different. He'd been smitten before, but not decapitated. He lay on his bed in autumn PMs during the tennis coach's required nap time, squeezing a tennis ball and talking for hours about this twirling, sprinkler obscured sophomore, while his doubles partner lay way on the other side of the huge bed, looking simultaneously at Oren and at the NE leaves changing colors in the tree outside the window. The schoolboy epithet they'd made up to refer to Oren's twirler was PGOAT, for the prettiest girl of all time. It wasn't the entire attraction, but she really was almost grotesquely lovely. She made the moms look like some sort of piece of fruit you think you want to take out of the bin, but then once you're right there over the bin, you put back because from close up you can see a much fresher and less preserved seeming piece of fruit elsewhere in the bin. The twirler was so pretty that not even the senior BU football terriers could summon the saliva to speak to her as athletic mixers. In fact, she was almost universally shunned. The twirler induced in heterosexual males that what UHID later told her was termed action complex, which is a kind of deep phylogenic fear of transhuman beauty. About all Oren's doubles partners who, as a strabistic, was something of an expert on female unattainability, felt he could do was warn O that this was the kind of hideously attractive girl you just knew in advance did not associate with normal collegiate human males, and clearly attended BU athletic social functions only out of a sort of bland scientific interest while she waited for the cleft-chinned ascopartic male model looking wildly successful in business adult males she doubtless was involved with to telephone her from the back seat of his green stretch Infinity, etc. No major sport player had ever even orbited in close enough to hear the elisions and apical lapses of a mid-southern accent in her oddly flat but resonant voice that sounded like someone enunciating very carefully inside a soundproof enclosure. When she danced at dances, It was with other cheerleaders and twirlers and pep squad territoriettes because no male had the grit or spit to ask her. Oren himself couldn't get closer than 4 meters at parties because he suddenly couldn't figure out where to put the stresses in the Charles Tavis unwitting inspired describe the sort of man you find attractive and I'll affect the demeanor of that sort of man strategic opening that had worked so well with on other BU subjects. It took 3 hearings for him to figure out that her name wasn't Joel. The big hair was red gold, and the skin peachy tinged pale, and arms freckled and zygomatics indescribable, and her eyes an extra natural HD green. He wouldn't learn till later that the almost pungently clean, line dried laundry scent that hung about her was a special low P dandelion attar, decocted special by her chemist daddy in Shiny Prize, Kentucky. Boston University's tennis team, needless to say, had neither cheerleaders nor baton twirling pep squads, which were reserved for major and large crowd sports. This is pretty understandable. The tennis coach took Oren's decision hard, and Oren had to hand him a Kleenex and stand there for several minutes under the poster of an avuncular Big Bill Tilden, standing there in WW2 era long white pants and ruffling a ball boy's hair. Oren watched the Kleenex sagify and get holes blown through it, while he tried to articulate just what he meant by burnt out and withered husk and carrot. The coach kept asking if this meant Oren's mother wouldn't be coming down to watch practice anymore. Oren's now former doubles partner, a strabismic and faggy sweatered but basically decent guy who also happened to be heir to the Nickerson Farms meat facsimile fortune, had his cleft-chinned and solidly BU connected dad make a couple quick calls from the back seat of his forest green Lexus, BU's head football coach, the Boss Terrier, an exiled Oklahoman who really did wear a gray crew neck sweatshirt with a whistle on a string, was intrigued by the size of the left forearm and hand extended, impolitely but intriguingly, during introductions. This was Oren's tennis arm, roughly churn sized. The other, whose dimensions were human, was hidden under a sport coat draped strategically over the aspiring walk on's right shoulder. But you can't play US football with a draped sport coat, and Oren's only real speed was in tiny 3 meter lateral bursts. And then it turned out that the idea of actually making direct physical contact with an opponent was so deeply ingrained as alien and horrific that Oren's tryouts, even at reserve positions, were too pathetic to describe. He was called a drag ass, and then a mollygag, and then a bona fide fried pussy. He was finally told that he seemed to have some kind of empty swinging sack where his balls ought to be, and that if he wanted to keep his scholarship, he might ought to stick to minor type sports where what you hit didn't up and hit you back. The coach finally actually grabbed Oren's face mask and pointed to the mouth of the field's southern tunnel. Oren walked south off the field solo and disconsolate, helmet under his little right arm, with not even a wistful glance back at the pep squad's PGOAT, practicing baton aloft splits in a heart-rendingly distant way beneath the visitors' northern goalposts. What Metro Boston AAs are trite but correct about is that both Destiny Kisses and its dope slaps illustrate an individual person's basic personal powerlessness over the really meaningful events in his life, i.e., almost nothing important that ever happens to you happens because you engineer it. Destiny has no beeper. Destiny always leans trench coated out of an alley with some sort of psst that you usually can't even hear because you're in such a rush to or from something important you're trying to engineer. The destiny grade event that happened in Oren Incandenza at this point was that just as he was passing glumly under the home goalposts and entering the shadow of the south exit tunnel's adit, a loud and ominously orthopedic cracking sound, plus then shrieking, issued from somewhere on the field behind him. What had happened was that BU's best defensive tackle, a 180-kilo future pro who had no teeth and liked to color, practicing special teams punt rushes, not only blocked BU's varsity punter's kick, but committed a serious mental error and kept coming and crashed into the little padless guy, while the punter's cleated foot was still up over his head, falling on him in a beefy heap and snapping everything from femur to tarsus in the punter's leg with a dreadful, high caliber snap. Two pep majorettes and a water boy fainted from the sound of the punter's screams alone. The block punt's ball caromed hard off the defensive tackle's helmet and bounced crazily and rolled untended all the way back to the shadow of the south tunnel, where Oren had turned to watch the punter writhe and the lineman rise with a finger in his mouth and a guilty expression. The defensive line coach disconnected his headset and dashed out and began blowing his whistle at the lineman at extremely close range, over and over, as the huge tackle started to cry and hit himself in the forehead with the heel of his hand. Since nobody else was close, Oren picked up the blocked punt's ball, which the head coach was gesturing impatient for from his position at the midfield bench. Oren held the football, which he had not been very good at doing during tryouts, holding on to it, feeling its weird oval weight, and looked way upfield at the stretcher bearers and punter and assistants and coach. It was too far to try to throw, and there was no way Oren was making another solo walk up the sideline and then back off the field again under the distant green gaze of the twirler who owned his CNS. Oren, for that seminal moment, had never tried to kick any sort of ball before in his whole life. Was the unengineered and kind of vulnerable revelation that ended up moving Joel Van Dyne way more than status or hang time. And as of that moment, as whistles fell from lips and people pointed, and under the same green and sprinkler hazed gaze, Oren found for himself, within competitive U.S. football, a new niche and carrot. A show type career he could never have dreamed of trying to engineer. Within days, he was punting 60 yards without a rush, practicing solo on an outside field with the special teams assistant, a dreamy, galoose smoking guy who invoked ideas of sky and flight, and called Oren Epheb, which a discreet phone call to his youngest brother revealed not to be the insult Oren had feared it sounded like. By the second week, O was up around 65 yards, still without a snap or rush, his rhythm clean and faultless, his concentration on the transaction between one foot and one leather egg almost frighteningly total. Nor by the third week was he much distracted by the 10 crazed pituitary giants bearing down as he took the snap and stepped forward, the gasps and crunching and meaty splats of interpersonal contact around him, this coolly type shuffle of the stretch bearers who came and went after the whistles blew. He'd been taken aside, and the empty scrotum crack apologized for, and it had been explained, complete with blow-ups of rule book pages, that regulations against direct physical contact with the punter were draconian, enforced by the threat of massive yardage and loss of possession. The rifle shot sounds of the ex-punter's now useless legs were 1 in a million sounds, he was assured. The head coach let Oren overhear him telling the defense that any man misfortunate enough to impact the team's new stellar punt man could just keep on walking after the play was over, all the way to the south tunnel and the stadium exit and the nearest transportation to some other institution of learning and ball. It was pretty obviously the start of football season. Crisp air, everything half dead, burning leaves, hot chocolate, raccoon coats, and halftime twirling, and something called the wave. Crowds exponentially larger and more demonstrative than tennis tournament crowds. Home versus SUNY Buffalo, home versus Syracuse, AT Boston College, AT Rhode Island, home versus the despised Minutemen of UMass Amherst. Oren's average reached 69 yards per kick and was still improving. his eyes fixed on the twin inducements of a gleaming baton and a massive developmental carrot he hadn't felt since age 14. He punted the football better and better as his motion, a dancerly combination of moves and weight transfers, every bit as complex and precise as a kick serve, got more instinctive, and he found his hamstrings and adductors loosening through constant and high impact competitive punting, his left cleat finishing at 90 degrees to the turf, knee to his nose, rocket kicking in the midst of crowd noise so rabid and entire it seemed to remove stadium's air, the one huge wordless orgasmic voice rising and creating a vacuum that sucked the ball after it into the sky, the leather egg receding as it climbed in a perfect spiral, seeming to chase the very crowd roar it had produced.